continues in Syria. 5,000 people are dying every month, says the United Nations, making it the worst genocide since Rwanda. In the meantime, President Bashar al-Assad continues to tighten his grips over cities along a north-south axis in the country's west. This as the rebel movement is becoming increasingly fractious, along with an escalating power struggle between the moderates and hardline Islamists. And all of this is feeding into concerns that if Washington and its allies were to arm the rebels, where would those arms end up? So, whatever happened to the Geneva Peace Conference, it does seem that the prospects for peace are dimming by the second. Joining me to discuss this here in the studio is William Jordan, a former US State Department official based in Damascus. Oleg Kopsev, a Russia specialist from the American University of Paris. From Beirut, Martin Chulov, the Guardian's Middle East correspondent, who's been in and out of Syria on numerous occasions in the last 2 years. And from Washington, Majed Ravizadeh, a Syrian-Iranian political analyst and lecturer at Oxford University. I'd like to thank all of those gentlemen for being with us. And before we do get started, I'm going to remind you, the viewer, that is, that you can also tell us what you think via Twitter. Just use the hashtag F24Debate. First of all, William, the longer this plays out, the greater danger there is of a regional war. Now, you know, in recent days, there's been reports of Israel embarking on yet another airstrike against, you know, what's believed to be anti-ship missiles made by Russia. You've got, yet even today, a roadside explosion in Lebanon. I mean, there's extraordinary danger, and that continues to increase, doesn't it?
Well, it's been a regional conflict for a while. And I mean, you mentioned Lebanon. I mean, it's the connections between Syria and Lebanon are such that almost from the day the civil war basically became a civil war in Syria, the Lebanese have been involved, whether they wanted to be or not. Israel's involvement, as you pointed out, tends to be somewhat specific. You've had situations involving border crossings along the Golan Heights, rebel activity up there, taking over from Syrian army, and then Israeli concerns, justifiable, I think, about Russian and other advanced weapons that might be introduced into Syria that could one way or another be brought into play, possibly against Israel. You know, but you didn't mention Iraq. I mean, there's the Iraqi aspect of this, and all of these claims that the Islamic State of Iraq, the Al-Qaeda affiliate there, is sending weapons and people into Syria. Even now, a discussion about the Taliban from Pakistan.
But it's sort of sporadic sort of hotspots here and there. You know, I'm talking about a much more general regional war.
I think that what we're seeing now is what we're likely to continue to see unless, and Oleg brought up Turkey, unless there's some sort of an incident either along the Turkish border or involving Jordan. I mean, we have had, I mean, the other big flashpoint, of course, is Lebanon, because Hezbollah's involvement gives a pretext, as if they really need it, in Lebanon to anti-Hezbollahi forces in Lebanon, stirring up things inside of Lebanon. And if I'm not mistaken, Lebanon's internal political situation is still highly unresolved in terms of the appointment and installation of a new government, a permanent government. So, you know, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to rumble along like this for a while with sporadic flashpoints. I don't see, absent some currently unforeseeable but always possible situation that causes Turkey or another outside power to come in.
Now, one scary dimension is that we always talk about arms in strategic terms. The problem is also commercial, is that there are people out there who have pretty much been put out of business by the end of the Cold War, but who need to sell arms. And that is essentially Russia, China, the United States, France, Great Britain, and several other countries and several other multinational corporations. And we have to realize also is that the more there is conflict, the more there is risk of conflict, You have mentioned a few potential hotspots, and there could be worse. You mentioned Jordan. There could be an Arab Spring in Jordan,
And
I'm
certainly
afraid,
the
any time.
Jordanians are very concerned about blowback,
Yes.
aren't they?
And or there could be an Arab Spring in Turkey as well. We've seen maybe not the beginning of that, but a little embryo of instability in Turkey, what was going on Taksim Square recently. And we have to realize that although diplomats are afraid of this, whether it's in the White House or in the Kremlin, there are others who are rubbing their hands because this is business. So I think this also has to be very clearly stated. It's very politically incorrect to mention this, but there are commercial interests out there that need conflict.
At this point, then we bring in Martin Chulov from Beirut. Obviously, where you are, Martin, there's a great concern about spillover into Lebanon, and we've already seen examples of that, haven't we?
Absolutely, and I would say that the strategic dimensions of what is taking place in Syria simply cannot be overstated. At one level, we're looking for the battle for a destiny of a nation state. But if you take that a bit further, this could very, very easily bleed into a festering conflict in Iraq, the perennial instability in Lebanon, and worst case scenario down track. I'm not saying we're there yet, I'm not saying we're close, but worst case scenario would be the balkanization of the Levant along ethnic sectarian lines. And where would that leave us? That is the breaking down of the post-Ottoman boundaries. That is a very, very different Middle East. It's being talked about ad nauseum within the opposition-held parts of Syria. In Lebanon, where I'm based, there's lots of discussion about this as well. And the involvement of Hezbollah, the overt and very belligerent posture taken by Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah back in May when he publicly acknowledged that Hezbollah were fighting for the strategically important town of Qusayr, which they won, that has played very poorly in the Sunni Arab world. And it has added a dimension to an already deepening sectarian conflict from Oman to Morocco. It's very, very potent out there. I've done a lot of traveling in the last 6 to 9 months, right across the Arab world, and everywhere I sit with, from Arab leaders to street sweepers to anybody, this sectarian dimension is talked about all the time, and it is deeply disturbing.
Majid, as the West continues to stall as to what to do and thousands continue to be slaughtered, have we passed the point of no return?
No, I don't think so. I think there are some still policy recommendations that can help. But if you allow me just, Nate, add one point to the previous question and what your other guest suggested. I think the notion of regional configuration, Syria turned into a regional configuration in the sense that there will be conventional war between all different states in the region. I think it's a little overstated, and it doesn't stand up against the historic evidence of countries which have gone through civil war. If you look at the analysis of the countries which have gone through multi-layered civil war, usually the neighboring countries prefer to have a proxy war in that country rather than really that country explode into some sort of conflagration, conventional war between those countries. And that's why you see Syria has turned into one of the, you can say, largest proxy battleground, the regional and international proxy battleground since Mujahideen in 80s or Vietnam War. So I believe that you might see spillover of the conflict into other countries, and you might see some heightened tension between sectarian and political, I think, landscapes. But the regional countries, I think, prefer to have their proxies fighting inside Syria, and it is really improbable to see that we have some sort of conventional war in Syria, in Middle East or in the region. But concerning your second question, I think there are some still policy recommendations, but I don't think there might be practical now, or I don't think that the countries which might implement these policy recommendations might be now willing to do that. And I'm referring to the West. I think to stop the violence in Syria, at this point, we really need a military threat against Assad regime. Otherwise, the balance of power is not going to shift inside the country. There should be some, I'm not talking about intervening in Syria, but what I'm saying is that there should be some serious military threat that change the calculation of Assad. Assad has been witnessing that there is some reluctance in the West, and it is very vivid and obvious that they really don't want to get involved in this crisis.
Majid, what you're saying is Assad is capitalizing on that, and as a result, he's strengthening his grip.
Right. I mean, I mean, the recent events, Hezbollah coming out on his side, Russia and his supporters is emboldening the Assad regime. I think what we need here, a serious military threat, like that they know, the Assad know that if he continues, there would be then some sort of really military actions against him. I think that would change the calculation of the regime. It can be no-fly zone. It can be some serious military threat that change the balance of military power inside Syria.
Martin, just following on from what Majid has just been saying, at the end of the day, this is not going to move one jot further while there's still a lot of concern about that infighting within the rebel movement between hardline Islamists and the more moderates. Is it possible for Syria's rebels to break the nexus with those jihadists?
Well, they're certainly trying to do that. Ever since they first came into the country, which was about this time a year ago, it was the start of last Ramadan when we first started to see them in and around Aleppo. Before that, their presence was absolutely insignificant. But now they are a sizable minority, a formidable fighting force. They've done most of the raids on many of the military bases in the north, and they've seized a lot of weapons from them. They're very well armed, and they're becoming ever more, I guess, bolshy in their approach. The mainstream group's reaction to them had been, firstly, they treated them as I guess, wayfarers or brothers who were looking to come and help them, and they were beholden culturally to take them in because they were there to fight for them. After a while, it became very clear that they had a different cause, a different way of going about things, and for many months it was, let's just try and keep them at bay, get rid of the regime, and we'll deal with them later. As this has dragged on, it's now increasingly obvious that the regime isn't going anywhere fast and that the jihadi presence needs to be dealt with. So part of what we're looking at now is a creeping awakening of sorts, the same sort of thing we saw in Anbar in 2006 in Iraq, where the tribes, the local communities rose up against the jihadis who had overplayed their hand and were ever more involved in tribal life. They were executing, they were imposing a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. There is a groundswell of this sort of movement in parts of the country, Hasaka, Raqqa, Aleppo and Idlib, and even in the Latakia area, where we did see one of the Free Syria Army commanders attacked and killed this week by a jihadist group. This could go one of two ways. It could either weaken the growing hold that these groups have on parts of the country, or it could embolden communities and other groups among this I guess this patchwork quilt of the opposition to fall in behind the Free Syria Army and chase these guys out of town. We're at this phase now where this is all being played out. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I do think it is going to derail opposition efforts to advance into areas of the country in which they're keen to get to for quite a few months yet.
William, where does Washington stand in all of this?
Publicly, I think Washington's message is a bit naive and is a bit out of touch with the reality on the ground. I mean, behind the scenes, it seems very clear from the reporting that I've seen out of Washington and from what I've gleaned talking to people that they understand what's actually happening. I suspect there's a lot of hair tearing in Langley, where the CIA is, as well as the State Department, over the fact that the opposition military council is so inept at being able to manage a centralized campaign of any kind. And there's a lot of discussion in Washington, between the administration and Congress in terms of finally giving arms to the rebels, in terms of how that's going to be done to prevent sort of the bad Islamists and the jihadists from getting these weapons and being able to use them. And I've said on this platform many times in the past that that's a fantasy. I mean, it's completely stupid to believe that you can somehow give weapons to certain people, and they won't fall into the hands of the other people. Battlefields are by their very nature chaotic. And
messy places.
Exactly. We saw in Afghanistan that a lot of the very people we did not want to get the weapons, or would never have thought we wanted them to get the weapons, ended up getting them. And we either spent a lot of time trying to get them back, or we later found them turning up in other conflicts.
And that's what the Russians have been telling, or even that's the main issue of the Russians against the Americans, even from the days of Afghanistan. They say, look at what you have done to fight us in Afghanistan. Look at the mess that you have created against us and against yourselves. So that also explains the extremely inflexible position of Russia as well. And the more naivete, as you say, there is in Washington, the more there is inflexibility and Bismarckian realpolitik and almost Machiavellian politics in the Kremlin.
Majid, certainly for those Western governments and their concerns about arming the rebels, there's all sorts of worrying questions. For instance, what if those weapons were used in a sectarian massacre of Shiites and Alawites? What if the jihadis got hold of them and used them in a terrorist attack here in Europe? I mean, it's an absolutely logistical nightmare, isn't it?
I think from my perspective, the main reason that they're not delivering arms, I think the main reason is not really that they might fall in the hand of the Islamists. I think that's a concern. But I think the main reason is that they don't want to be dragged into another war inside Syria. And that's why you see reluctant really to deliver arms to the even those groups which are considered the legitimate groups and representative of the Syrian people. I don't think the West really, because of two reasons, they don't want to get involved in the other war in the Middle East. One is the public opinion. The public poll shows that the people are really the Western people, especially in Europe and United States, they're really reluctant that their governments get involved in other wars because of the economic and other concerns in these countries. And they even when you look at the donations, I mean, the people has been less willing to donate in the West for the Syrian crisis compared to the previous crisis with the same character. And I think the Iraq and Afghanistan war, I think, were lessons for the United States and West that prevent them really to get involved inside Syria, because if they arm the rebels, then we have direct involvement for other actors. I mean, they're like Russia and Iran. They are involved, but I think we will see more robust involvement inside Syria. And when we have different other actors which will be dragged into the conflict in Syria. And I think that's the primary reason that they've been not willing to deliver arms to the rebels.
Martin, while there's still no official arming of the rebels, I mean, the reality is there's a lot going on in secret, isn't there? I mean, for instance, you've got that US program which has been training rebels for the last few months. But from where you are, what sort of level of support is Washington and its allies actually giving the rebels on the ground at the moment?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Over the last 18 months or so, there have been weapons getting in, primarily from the north. They were Qatari weapons mainly, some Saudi, but mostly Qatari, and they were light battlefield weapons. They were Kalashnikovs, ammunition, RPGs, enough to keep the battle going, but not enough to win the war. And that was always the paradox. We used to see these weapons runs coming into Aleppo when all seemed to be lost on a certain front. All of a sudden, a few Utes would turn up with 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and they'd come across the border from Turkey. So there are significant stores of weapons in Turkey, but there are very clear checks and balances on where they go and how many are let in at a certain time. That said, I've had discussions with the Qataris in recent weeks, and they have said that they want to bring this to an end as soon as they possibly can. They have all, them and the Saudis, and to some extent the Turks, they've been waiting for the Americans to take the lead. And they now know that isn't going to happen, certainly not in the short term, and that they do feel as though they need to bring this to a head in some way, shape or form. So there have been some new weapons getting in, some heavier weapons as well. From Jordan, the Saudis have sent 2 or 3 significant supply runs of of buildings that can't take down, of weapons that can't take down planes, but they can destroy tanks, they can destroy buildings. These have made some gains on the battlefield, but as William said, they've also made their way up through the eastern deserts of Syria into the hands of some of the jihadists and some of these arms bazaars that are being set up. So it is impossible to contain the spread of these weapons to other groups around the country. And what we've seen in the last couple of months has been a litmus test of how far these weapons are going to reach and how quickly they're going to get there.
William.
Yeah, I just want to expand a little bit on what I think is Washington's view or thinking about this, and that is, I believe they painfully finally came to the conclusion that they had to give the rebels weapons, in order to try to force the conflict to a breaking point where you might actually be able, through some currently I think unimaginable, but at the time still plausible, strike at the regime, that would cause it to start to unravel, that would cause the masses of the mostly Sunni conscripts making up the bulk of the military, which I believe have still not defected, finally turn against the regime and cause things to unravel. I still think that Washington believes that this can happen and wants to figure out how to get weapons and better weapons into the...
Is it naive thinking on the part of Washington, though?
Well, here's the naive part. I think the calculation is still arguable, but somewhat valid. The problem is that the result is that's where the naive thinking comes into play, because the idea that somehow you tip over the regime, and then there's a new impetus to construct a new reality, and a more peaceful and more politically transparent reality, isn't going to happen. What's going to happen, in my view, is that you are going to move into the next and the real phase of the Syrian civil war, which is going to be truly bloody. It's going to be similar in length of time and in violence to the Lebanese civil war, and the international community is going to need to manage it, not try to resolve it.
William, I'm just going to have to leave it there, because some of you might be wondering where Francois Picard, who normally hosts this program, is. I can now reveal that he's in Egypt for a special edition of the debate that's going to be broadcast tomorrow, and he joins me from Cairo. Francois, it's been nearly 2 weeks since the military took power in Egypt. This Wednesday we saw, of course, the interim president being sworn in, but the country still remains dangerously divided, doesn't it?
It does. I was just listening to your guest there a moment ago, Annette, and whereas in Syria we're talking about sectarianism and a complicated patchwork, here 90% of the people are Sunni Muslims. We've just, in fact, broken the fast. It's the month of Ramadan here. So you would think that it'd be easy enough to get people around the table, but there is this bitter divide, and it could descend into something worse. We experienced it ourselves, Annette. We went to interview the former Secretary General of the Arab League, Amr Moussa, in the Garden City neighborhood of Cairo. There he was telling us that it wasn't a coup and that this was justified. Downstairs here we're on Tahrir Square, which is, I guess, fairly empty. I don't know if you can see it behind me. There the banners read "No to Terrorism," and there are posters of General Sisi, the defense minister, who's been named deputy prime minister this Tuesday. Over on the other side of town, we went to Nasser City, and there was a completely different scene. The Muslim Brotherhood have a big podium, people all breaking the fast there. People have been sleeping out in tents there for 2 weeks. This sort of embattled atmosphere. And there, the slogans read, "Restore democracy." So those are the battle lines right now.
As you just said, Francois, you were in Nasser City earlier today. What were people's reactions there to the swearing in of this interim government?
They reject it. We did an interview with the number 2 of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party, SM Al-Arian, which you'll see later on France 24. There, we talked to him about the fact that the spokesperson for the president had said there were talks ongoing with all parties. He denied it, saying the MB was not speaking to what he called the army. He didn't call them the interim government. He just plain out called them the army and dismissed all the civilians that are in it.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Francois Picard. And of course, Francois will be back tomorrow night with a special edition which will be beamed out of Cairo. That's a special edition of the debate which will be broadcast this time tomorrow. That's 7:10 p.m. Paris time. Now, let me very quickly thank my guests tonight. They are, of course, William Jordan, Oleg Kobsev, from Beirut, Martin Chulov, and from Washington, Majed Rafi-Sadeh. Again, thanks for being with us, and do stay with us because coming up shortly will be more news and headlines.